the MV Krios, was turned back on March 9, 2026. Standard blockade enforcement. One of 9 vessels intercepted in the first 48 hours of the U.S. Navy's tightening of Iranian port access. Greek-flagged bulk carrier. Cargo manifest listed agricultural equipment bound for Izmir, Turkey. The ship was clean. Paperwork in order. Crew cooperative. By every measure, the Krios was routine, but the weight was wrong. Port of origin loading data showed the Krios's hold was 40% heavier than its declared cargo. Agricultural equipment doesn't gain 5,000 metric tons on its own. Nothing does. Unless the manifest is wrong. An analyst at the National Targeting Center in Sterling, Virginia, ran the numbers on March 11, 2026. Declared cargo weight from the bill of lading, 14,200 metric tons. Calculated weight derived from hull draft measurements and loading records at the port of origin, 19,880 metric tons. The difference, 5,680 metric tons that didn't exist on paper. The analyst's name was Maria Costas. She worked in the Trade Analytics Division of Homeland Security Investigations, a unit most people outside of federal law enforcement have never heard of. HSI processes thousands of shipping anomalies per year. Weight discrepancies are common. Misloaded containers, paperwork errors, unit conversion mistakes between metric and imperial. Most get resolved with a phone call to the port authority. Costas made the phone call. The port of origin listed on the Krios's manifest was Mersin, Turkey, a legitimate commercial port. She contacted the Mersin Port Authority's Cargo Records Office through the standard Customs Mutual Assistance Agreement channels. The response came back in 48 hours. Mersin had no record of loading the MV Krios in February 2026. No berth assignment, no crane logs, no pilot dispatch. The ship had never been there. The manifest said Mersin. The port said no. The ship weighed more than it should. 3 facts, none of them matched. Costas flagged the case on March 13th. File number NTC-2026-03-4471. Priority, moderate. In the hierarchy of trade enforcement, a single vessel with a paperwork discrepancy and a weight mismatch is not an emergency. It's an anomaly. Anomalies get queued. Her supervisor reviewed the flag that afternoon. The Krios had already been turned back by the Navy. It was no longer in the blockade zone. The vessel was now steaming west through the Arabian Sea, presumably heading back toward the Mediterranean. The supervisor's assessment: the blockade worked. Ship was intercepted. No contraband landed. Case could be closed as a successful enforcement action. Costas disagreed. She noted this in the case log. The supervisor's response was a single line in the internal messaging system. NTC-03-4471 resolved at interdiction. Recommend close. The case sat for 6 days. Technically open, effectively dead, but Costas had the Krios's maritime mobile service identity number, the unique 9-digit identifier that every commercial vessel broadcasts via its automatic identification system transponder. AIS data is archived. Every position ping, every course change, every speed adjustment, recorded and stored. On March 19th, during a gap in her primary caseload, she pulled the Krios's AIS history for the 30 days prior to its interception. The manifest route was simple: Mersin, Turkey, to Bandar Abbas, Iran, to the Strait of Hormuz, where it was turned back. A straight commercial transit. The AIS data told a different story. On February 27th, the Krios departed not from Mersin but from Piraeus, Greece, home port of its parent company. It transited the Suez Canal on March 1st and entered the Arabian Sea on March 4th. On March 6th, 3 days before its interception, the ship made an unscheduled stop. Chabahar, Iran's southeastern port, outside the Persian Gulf. Outside the primary blockade zone, the stop lasted 14 hours. 14 hours is not a fuel stop. It's not a weather delay. It's a loading operation. The Krios arrived at Chabahar with a draft of 9.2 meters. It departed with a draft of 11.8 meters. The ship sank 2.6 meters deeper into the water over those 14 hours. Something heavy went into that hold. After Chabahar, the Krios turned northwest into the Gulf of Oman and headed straight for the Strait of Hormuz, directly into the blockade zone. It was intercepted 12 hours later. Costas now had a ship that lied about its origin port, made a secret stop at an Iranian facility, loaded undeclared cargo, and then sailed into a U.S. naval blockade with a manifest that didn't match its weight. She updated the case file on March 19th and reflagged it. This time, she didn't route it through her supervisor. She sent it directly to the HSI attaché office responsible for maritime trade fraud, based in The Hague. The Hague office had access to something Costas didn't: Lloyd's List Intelligence, the global shipping database that tracks vessel ownership, registration history, insurance records, and corporate structures. Within 24 hours, the attaché team pulled the Krios' ownership chain. The MV Krios was registered to a Liberian shell company called Oceanic Freight Holdings Limited, which was a wholly owned subsidiary of Aegean Bulk Partners, a mid-sized shipping firm headquartered in Piraeus, Greece. Aegean Bulk Partners operated a fleet of 12 dry bulk carriers, ranging from 25,000 to 45,000 deadweight tonnage. The company had been in operation since 2019. Its principal shareholders were listed as 2 Greek nationals and a holding entity registered in the Marshall Islands. Nothing unusual. Thousands of shipping companies operate with exactly this structure. Flags of convenience, offshore holding companies, layered ownership. The maritime industry runs on opacity, but Costas had asked a specific question in her referral to The Hague. Check the AIS histories of all 12 Aegean bulk vessels. Not just the Krios. All of them. The results came back on March 24th, 2026. 5 of the 12 vessels had made similar undeclared stops near Iranian ports over the previous 4 months. The MV Thetis, Chabahar, November 2025. The MV Pelion, Bandar Jask, December 2025. The MV Argos, Chabahar again, January 2026. The MV Delos, Jask, February 2026. And the Krios in March. 5 ships, 5 unscheduled stops. 5 manifests that listed cargo origins in Turkey, Oman, or the UAE, never Iran. Every stop occurred within 72 hours of the vessel entering a sanctioned transit zone. If you hit the like button, more people find this investigation. That's how the algorithm works. The pattern was there. Costas could see it. But pattern alone doesn't make a federal case. What was being loaded at those Iranian ports? The manifest said agricultural equipment, construction materials, bulk minerals, generic categories. Hard to disprove without physically inspecting the cargo, and 4 of the 5 ships had already delivered their loads to European ports months earlier. The cargo was gone, consumed by whatever supply chain had purchased it. Costas needed the money trail. That's where the investigation crossed from HSY trade enforcement into something bigger. On March 26th, she submitted a financial intelligence request through FinCEN, the Treasury Department's financial crimes enforcement network. She asked for any suspicious activity reports filed against Aegean Bulk Partners, its subsidiaries, or its listed officers in the past 12 months. The response came back in 3 days. There were no SARs against Aegean Bulk Partners. Clean record. But FinCEN's analyst ran a secondary check, cross-referencing the company's known bank accounts against the Treasury Department's OFAC sanctions list, the master database of individuals and entities subject to U.S. economic sanctions. 1 hit. On January 15, 2026, Aegean Bulk's chief financial officer, a Greek national named Dimitrios Katsaros, had wired $2.3 million from a corporate account at Piraeus Bank to an account at Emirates NBD in Dubai. The recipient was a company called Al Waha Trading FZE. Al-Waha Trading FZE had been placed on the OFAC Specially Designated Nationals list in September 2025. Designated as a facilitator of Iranian sanctions evasion, any U.S.-connected financial institution processing transactions involving Al-Waha was required to freeze the funds and report the activity. The wire had gone through. Piraeus Bank processed it. Emirates NBD received it. Neither flagged it. The OFAC designation was 5 months old when the wire was sent. $2.3 million to a sanctioned entity from the CFO of a company whose ships were making secret stops at Iranian ports. The financial thread and the maritime thread had just connected. This was no longer a shipping anomaly. On March 29, 2026, HS formally referred the case to the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. FBI counterintelligence handles sanctions evasion cases that involve foreign state actors or strategic commodities. The referral triggered an immediate review at FBI headquarters in Washington. By March 31st, a joint task force had been assembled. HSI for the maritime and trade fraud components, FBI for the counterintelligence and financial investigation, and the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control for Sanctions Enforcement. The task force was designated Operation Aegean Passage. It was given a 60-day operational window and authority to coordinate with foreign law enforcement through Europol and bilateral agreements with Greece, the UAE, Oman, and Turkey. The first priority was identifying what cargo was actually being loaded at Chabahar and Bandar Jask. The manifests were useless. The ships had already delivered their loads, but the task force had one advantage. The Krios had been intercepted. It had been turned back. If the Krios had loaded cargo at Chabahar and then been turned back before offloading, that cargo might still be on the ship. On April 1, 2026, Greek authorities, acting on a formal U.S. request through the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, boarded the MV Krios at its berth in Piraeus. The inspection took 11 hours. The hold contained 14,200 metric tons of combine harvester components and irrigation fittings, consistent with the manifest. It also contained 5,400 metric tons of aluminum ingots and 280 metric tons of petrochemical intermediates packed in sealed drums. None of this appeared on any document. The aluminum ingots bore mill markings from Iranian Aluminum Company, known as Iralco, one of Iran's largest state-affiliated aluminum smelters. Iralco had been under U.S. sanctions since 2018. The petrochemical drums carried batch codes traceable to Bandar Imam Petrochemical Complex, also sanctioned. Iranian-origin aluminum and Iranian-origin petrochemicals, hidden beneath legitimate agricultural cargo. On a Greek-flagged ship owned by a Piraeus company whose CFO had wired millions to a sanctioned Dubai intermediary. Now the task force knew what was moving. The next question was where it had been going. The 4 previous shipments from the Thetis, Pelion, Argos, and Delos had all been delivered to European ports. The Thetis offloaded in Rotterdam in November 2025, the Pelion in Genoa in December, the Argos in Hamburg in January 2026, the Delos in Antwerp in February. 4 ports, 4 countries, all major industrial hubs. Customs records at each port showed the cargo clearing under Turkish or Omani certificates of origin. Agricultural equipment, construction materials. The paperwork was clean because it had been prepared in advance. Turkish export certificates issued by a freight forwarding company in Istanbul called Anatolian Logistics Group, and Omani certificates from a broker in Muscat called Gulf Bridge Shipping Services. Both companies were real. Both had legitimate operations. Both had processed hundreds of standard shipments. But task force investigators discovered that both had also processed the specific bills of lading for the Aegean bulk vessels. And in each case, the cargo described on the Turkish or Omani certificates bore no relationship to what had actually been loaded at Iranian ports. The scheme was now visible in its entirety. Iranian-origin aluminum and petrochemical products, sanctioned materials from sanctioned facilities, were being loaded onto Aegean bulk partners vessels at Chabahar and Bandar Jask. The ships would then transit to a secondary port in Turkey or Oman, where the cargo would be assigned new certificates of origin. Turkish agricultural goods, Omani construction materials. The manifests were rewritten. The bills of lading were replaced. By the time the vessels reached European ports, the cargo appeared to originate from non-sanctioned countries. European manufacturers purchased the aluminum and petrochemicals, believing they were buying compliant materials. They paid market rates. The money flowed back through a chain of intermediaries to Aegean bulk partners in Piraeus, which took its cut, then wired payments through Al-Waha Trading in Dubai, which forwarded funds to accounts in Tehran. The blockade hadn't created the scheme. The scheme had been running since at least October 2025, based on the earliest AIS anomaly the task force could identify. But the blockade had provided cover. With dozens of ships being turned back, rerouted and delayed, the maritime traffic in the region was chaotic. Anomalies were harder to spot. AIS data was cluttered with irregular movements. The Aegean bulk vessels used the confusion to make their Iranian port calls look like the erratic behavior of ships navigating around a military operation. The irony was precise. A blockade designed to enforce sanctions had been used as camouflage for sanctions evasion. If you've gotten this far, leave a comment. At what point did you suspect the blockade itself was part of the cover? By April 5th, 2026, the task force had mapped the full network. 12 individuals directly involved in the logistics chain. 6 more on the financial side. Aegean Bulk Partners was the maritime backbone. Anatolian Logistics Group in Istanbul handled the Turkish documentation. Gulf Bridge Shipping Services in Muscat handled the Omani paperwork. Al-Waha Trading in Dubai moved the money. And 2 additional nodes the investigation had uncovered. A freight brokerage firm in Houston, Texas called Meridian Global Freight, and a metals trading company in London called Sterling Commodities Limited. Meridian Global Freight was the critical U.S. nexus. Run by 2 freight brokers, Nathan Waller and David Son, from a leased office on Westheimer Road in Houston. Waller and Aian had no visible connection to Iran or Greek shipping. They were mid-level logistics professionals who had previously worked for legitimate supply chain firms in the Houston Energy Corridor. Their role in the network was specific. Meridian processed the paperwork that allowed the relabeled cargo to enter the U.S.-connected financial system. When a European manufacturer purchased what it believed was Turkish aluminum through a standard commodities exchange, the letter of credit and trade finance documents routed through U.S. correspondent banks. Those banks required a U.S.-based freight verification to process the transaction. Meridian provided it. They signed off on certificates stating the cargo originated in Turkey. They attached Anatolian logistics documents as supporting evidence. The U.S. banks cleared the payments. Without Meridian, the money couldn't flow through the dollar-denominated system. Without the dollar system, the transactions couldn't clear at the volume the network required. Waller and Aian were the choke point. FBI surveillance of the Houston office began on April 3, 2026. Physical and electronic. Court-authorized wiretaps on both men's phones. Monitoring of Meridian's email servers. The task force needed to document active, ongoing criminal conduct, not just historical records. Over 4 days, agents recorded 17 phone calls between Aian and a contact in Istanbul they identified as a logistics coordinator for Anatolian Logistics Group. In 3 of those calls, Aian explicitly referenced upcoming shipments and discussed which certificates of origin to attach. In one call on April 5th, he told the Istanbul contact, "Use the Mersin stamp for this one. Rotterdam Customs hasn't questioned Mersin in 8 months." That call was the final piece. Active facilitation, documented on a federal wiretap. With that, the task force had grounds for arrest warrants, seizure orders, and coordinated enforcement actions across multiple jurisdictions. April 8, 2026. The operation went live at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. In Houston, FBI agents executed a search warrant at Meridian Global Freight's office at 4720 Westheimer Road. Nathan Waller was arrested at his home in Katy, Texas at 5:47 a.m. David San was arrested at the office when he arrived for work at 7:15 a.m. Agents seized 14 file boxes of shipping documents, 3 laptops, 2 external hard drives, and records of wire transfers totaling $38 million processed through Meridian's accounts over the previous 6 months. In Piraeus, Greek police, coordinating through Europol, arrested Dimitrios Katsaros at Aegean Bulk Partners headquarters on Akti Miauli Street. Simultaneously, Greek Coast Guard vessels intercepted and detained the MV Thetis and the MV Argos at their berths in Piraeus harbor. A third vessel, the MV Pelion, was seized by Italian authorities at the port of Genoa, where it had arrived the previous day. In Dubai, UAE financial authorities froze all accounts associated with Al Waha Trading, FZE. The freeze captured $87 million across 4 accounts at Emirates, NBD, and Mashrek Bank. In Istanbul, Turkish police detained 3 employees of Anatolian Logistics Group at their offices in the Beyoğlu district. Turkish authorities also seized the company's document archives, which contained pre-stamped blank certificates of origin, ready to be filled in with whatever cargo description a client required. In Muscat, Omani authorities froze accounts belonging to Gulf Bridge Shipping Services and detained its managing director. In London, the UK's National Crime Agency executed a warrant at Sterling Commodities Limited's office in the city. 2 traders were arrested. The NCA also froze $41 million in Sterling Commodities accounts at Barclays and HSBC. Total assets frozen across the 4 countries, $214 million. 3 vessels seized. 18 individuals indicted in the United States, with additional charges pending in Greece, the UK, and Turkey. The U.S. indictment, unsealed on April 9, 2026, in the Southern District of Texas, listed charges including conspiracy to violate the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, money laundering, wire fraud, and sanctions evasion. Waller and Sain each faced maximum sentences of 30 years. Katsaros was named as a co-defendant, with extradition proceedings initiated through the U.S.-Greece MLAT. The case generated immediate consequences for the European supply chain. 4 manufacturing firms in Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy, firms that had purchased the relabeled aluminum and petrochemicals, launched internal investigations. None had been charged. All claimed no knowledge of the material's true origin. Treasury Department officials stated publicly that the European companies were considered victims, not co-conspirators. But the materials they had purchased and already incorporated into manufactured goods, automotive components, industrial machinery, chemical products, now contained sanctioned Iranian inputs. Those goods could not legally be sold in the United States. Export licenses would be required. Compliance reviews would take months. For companies already operating on tight margins, the disruption was significant. Subscribe if you want to follow where this investigation goes next. The financial threads don't end with these arrests. The aftermath of Operation Aegean Passage raised questions that the indictment didn't answer. The first question: how did the wire transfers pass through the banking system undetected? Dimitrios Katsaros wired $2.3 million to an OFAC-designated entity through a major Greek bank. The transaction cleared. No flag, no hold, no report. OFAC designation of Al Waha Trading had been public for 5 months. Every financial institution connected to the U.S. dollar clearing system is required to screen transactions against the OFAC list in real time. Treasury investigators opened a separate inquiry into Piraeus Bank's compliance procedures. As of mid-April 2026, that inquiry is ongoing. No findings have been published. No bank employees have been charged. The second question: the pre-stamped blank certificates of origin found at Anatolian Logistics Group in Istanbul. Blank certificates of origin from a Turkish government customs authority, sitting in a private company's filing cabinet, ready to be filled in with any cargo description, any origin, any destination. Those stamps are issued by the Turkish Ministry of Trade. How did they end up in bulk supply at a freight forwarding company? Turkish authorities acknowledge the seizure but have not publicly addressed how the stamps were obtained. The 3 detained Anatolian logistics employees were released on bail within 72 hours. No charges have been filed in Turkey as of April 16, 2026. The third question concerned the European manufacturers. They purchased thousands of metric tons of aluminum and petrochemicals. They incorporated these materials into finished products. Standard procurement procedures require supply chain verification, origin checks, sanction screening, end-use certificates. 4 companies across 3 countries all failed to detect that their Turkish agricultural shipments were Iranian industrial commodities. All 4 companies used the same metals trading intermediary, Sterling Commodities Limited in London. Sterling Commodities had provided documentation that appeared legitimate, but investigators found that Sterling's due diligence files, the records they were supposed to maintain proving the origin and legality of every commodity they traded, contained copies of the same fraudulent Turkish certificates created by Anatolian Logistics Group. Sterling hadn't verified. They had passed through. Whether Sterling's traders knew the certificates were fraudulent or simply never checked is the core question of the UK prosecution now underway. Maria Kostas returned to her regular caseload at the National Targeting Center in mid-April 2026. The case she had flagged on March 13th, the one her supervisor recommended closing as a resolved interdiction, had led to the largest maritime sanctions enforcement action of the year. Her supervisor's recommendation to close case NTC-2026-03-4471 remained in the system logs. The supervisor was not named in any public filing. No internal review of the recommendation has been announced. The MV Krios sat impounded in Piraeus Harbor, the MV Thetis and MV Argos alongside it. 3 ships motionless, costing their insurers docking fees that accumulated daily. The remaining 9 vessels in the Aegean Bulk Partners fleet continued to operate under the management of a court-appointed trustee, pending resolution of the criminal proceedings. Of the $214 million frozen, $87 million sat in Dubai accounts that the UAE had agreed to hold, but not repatriate. The legal framework for returning those funds to the United States, or to the European companies that had been defrauded, remained unresolved. UAE financial cooperation with U.S. sanctions enforcement has been inconsistent. The funds were frozen. Whether they would ever move again was a separate question. The blockade of Iranian ports continued. Ships were still being turned back daily. The Navy's interdiction statistics showed a 92% compliance rate among commercial vessels approaching the zone. But the Aegean bulk operation had demonstrated something the compliance rate didn't capture. The 8% that turned back weren't all failures. Some were deliberate. Some were ships that had already loaded their real cargo at a secondary port, used the blockade approach as misdirection, and would have offloaded somewhere else entirely if they hadn't been caught. The question wasn't how many ships were turned back. The question was how many ships like the Krios were never flagged at all. 5 vessels in one company's fleet over 4 months. One company out of hundreds operating in the region. One analyst who noticed a weight discrepancy and didn't close the file when she was told to. The 5,680 metric tons that didn't match. That was the gap that opened the case. In shipping, gaps like that occur constantly. In most cases, someone closes the file. In this case, someone didn't.